A reading from Bear's Library. The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka, Part 2 of 3.
Not until dusk did Gregor awake from his heavy, almost comatose sleep. Probably he would have awoken around that time anyway, even if he hadn't been roused, because he felt sufficiently rested and restored. Still, it seemed to him as though a hurried footfall and a cautious shutting of the door to the hallway had awoken him. The pale gleam of the electric steer lightings outside showed on the ceiling and on the upper parts of the furniture, but down on the floor, where Gregor lay, it was dark. Slowly he rose, and groping clumsily with his feelers, whose function he only now began to understand, he made for the door, to see what had happened there. His whole left side was one long, unpleasantly stretched scab, and he was positively limping on his 2 rows of legs. One of his little legs had been badly hurt in the course of the morning's incidents. It was a wonder that it was only one, and it dragged after the rest inertly. Not until he reached the door did he realize what had tempted him there. It was the smell of food. There stood a dish full of sweetened milk, with little slices of white bread floating in it. He felt like laughing for joy, because he was even hungrier now than he had been that morning, and straightway he dunked his head into the milk past his eyes. But before long he withdrew again in disappointment. It wasn't just that he found eating difficult on account of his damaged left flank. It seemed he could only eat if the whole of his body, panting, participated. More that he disliked the taste of milk, which otherwise was a favorite drink, and which his sister had certainly put out for him for that reason. In fact, he pulled his head away from the dish almost with revulsion and crawled back into the middle of the room. In the living room, the gas jet had been lit, as Gregor saw by looking through the crack in the door, but whereas usually at this time his father would be reading aloud to Gregor's mother, or sometimes to his sister, from the afternoon edition of the newspaper, there was now only silence. Well, it was possible that this reading aloud, of which his sister had written and spoken to him in many times, had been discontinued of late. But it was equally quiet to either side, even though it was hardly possible that there was no one home. What a quiet life the family used to lead, Gregor said to himself, and staring into the blackness, he felt considerable pride that he had made such a life possible for his parents and his sister, and in such a lovely flat. But what if all peace, all prosperity, all contentment were to come to a sudden and terrible end? So as not to fall into such thoughts, Gregor thought he would take some exercise instead, and he crawled back and forth in the room. Once, in the course of the long evening, one of the side doors was opened a crack, and once the other, and then hurriedly closed again. Someone seemed to feel a desire to step inside, but then again had too many cavils about doing so. Gregor took up position right against the living room door, resolved to bring in the reluctant visitor in some way if he could, or if nothing more, at least discover his identity. But then the door wasn't opened again, and Gregor waited in vain. Previously, when the doors were locked, everyone had tried to come in and see him, but now that he had opened one door himself, and the others had apparently been opened in the course of the day, no visitors came, and the keys were all on the outside too. The light in the living room was left on far into the night, and that made it easy to verify that his parents and his sister had stayed up till then, because as he could very well hear, that was when the 3 of them left on tiptoed feet. Now it was certain that no one would come into Gregor's room until morning, so he had a long time ahead of him to reflect undisturbed on how he could reorder his life. But the empty high-ceilinged room, where he was forced to lie flat on the floor, disquieted him, without him being able to find a reason for his disquiet, because after all this was the room he had lived in these past 5 years, and with a half-unconscious turn, and not without a little shame, he hurried under the sofa, where even though his back was pressed down a little, and he was unable to raise his head, he straightway felt very much at home, and only lamented the fact that his body was too broad to be entirely concealed under the sofa. He stayed there all night, either half asleep, albeit awoken by hunger at regular intervals, or kept half awake by anxieties and unclear hopes, which all seemed to lead to the point that he would comport himself quietly for the moment, and by the patience and utmost consideration for the family make the inconvenience he was putting them through in his present state a little bearable for him. Early the next morning, while it was almost still night, Gregor had an opportunity to put his resolutions to the test, because the door from the hallway opened, and his sister, almost completely dressed, looked in on him with some agitation. It took her a while to find him, but when she spotted him under the sofa, my God, he had to be somewhere. He couldn't have flown off into space. She was so terrified that in an uncontrollable revulsion she slammed the door shut. But then, as if sorry for her behavior, she straightway opened the door again and tiptoed in, as if calling on a grave invalid or even a stranger. Gregor had pushed his head forward to the edge of the sofa and observed her. Would she notice that he had left his milk, and then not by any means because he wasn't hungry, and would she bring it in some different food that would suit him better? If she failed to do so of her own accord, then he preferred to die rather than tell her, even though he did feel an incredible urge to shoot out from under the sofa, hurl himself at his sister's feet, and ask her for some nice tidbit to eat. But his sister was promptly startled by the sight of the full dish, from which only a little milk had been spilled around the edges. She picked it up right away, not with her bare hands, but with a rag, and carried it out. Gregor was dying to see what she would bring him instead, and he entertained all sorts of conjectures on the subject. But never would he have been able to guess what in the goodness of her heart his sister did. She brought him, evidently to get a sense of his likes and dislikes, a whole array of things, all spread out on an old newspaper. There were some half-rotten vegetables, bones left over from dinner, with a little congealed white sauce, a handful of raisins and almonds, a cheese that had a couple of days ago Gregor had declared to be unfit for human consumption, a piece of dry bread, a piece of bread with butter, and a piece of bread and butter sprinkled with salt. In addition, she set down a dish that was probably to be given over to Gregor's personal use, into which she had poured some water. Then, at a sheer delicacy, knowing that Gregor wouldn't be able to eat in front of her, she hurriedly left the room, even turning the key, just as a sign to Gregor that he could settle down and take this time over everything. Gregor's legs trembled as he addressed his meal. His wounds, too, must have completely healed over, for he didn't feel any hindrance. He was astonished to realize and remembered how, a little more than a month ago, he had cut his finger with a knife, and only the day before yesterday the place still had hurt. I wonder if I have less sensitivity now, he thought, as he sucked avidly on the cheese, which of all the proffered foodstuffs had most spontaneously and powerfully attracted him. Then, in rapid succession, and with eyes watering with satisfaction, he ate up the cheese, the vegetables, and the sauce. The fresh foods, on the other hand, were not to his liking. He couldn't even bear the smell of them, and dragged such things as he wanted to eat a little way away from them. He was long done with everything, and was just lounging lazily where he had eaten, when his sister, to signal that he was to withdraw, slowly turned the key in the lock. That immediately stung him out of his drowsiness, and he dashed back under the sofa. But it cost him a great effort to remain there. Even for a short time his sister was in the room, because his big meal had filled out his belly, and he was scarcely able to breathe in his little space. Amidst little fits of panic suffocation, he watched with slightly bulging eyes as his sister, all unawares, swept everything together with a broom. Not only the leftovers, but also those elements of food that Gregor hadn't touched, as though they too were now not good for anything. And as she hastily tipped everything into a bucket, on which she set a wooden lid, whereupon she carried everything back out. No sooner had she turned her back than Gregor came out from under the sofa, stretched, and pulled himself up. This was how Gregor was now fed every day. Once in the morning, while his parents and the maid were still asleep, and a second time after lunch, when his parents had their little lie-down and his sister sent the maid out on some errand or other. For sure, none of them wanted Gregor to starve, but maybe they didn't want to confront in such material detail the idea of him eating anything. Perhaps also his sister wanted to spare them a little grief, because certainly they were suffering enough as it was. With what excuses the doctor and locksmith were got rid of on that first morning was something Gregor never learned, because as he was not able to make himself understood, it didn't occur to anyone, not even his sister, that he could understand others. And so, when his sister was in his room, he had to content himself with hearing her occasional sighs and appeals to various saints. Only later, once she had got adjusted to everything a little, of course there could be no question of becoming fully used to it, Gregor sometimes caught a well-intentioned mark, or one that was capable of being interpreted as such. He had a good appetite today, she said, when Gregor had dealt with his food in determined fashion, whereas in the opposite case, which came to be the rule, she would sometimes say almost sorrowfully, "Oh, it's hardly been touched today." While Gregor was not given any news directly, he was sometimes able to glean developments from the adjoining rooms, and whenever he heard anyone speaking, he would rush to the door in question and press his whole body against it. Especially in the early days, there was no conversation that did not somehow, in some oblique way, deal with him. For 2 days, at each meal, there were debates as to how one ought to behave, and in between meals the same subject was also discussed, because there were always at least 2 members of the household at home, probably as no one wanted to be alone at home, and couldn't in any case wholly leave it. On the very first day, the cook had begged on her knees, it was unclear what and how much she knew about what had happened, to be let go right away, and when she took her leave, a quarter of an hour later, she said thank you for her dismissal, as if it was the greatest kindness she had experienced here, and without anyone demanding it of her, gave the most solemn oath never to betray the least thing to anyone. Now his sister had to do the cooking in harness with his mother. Admittedly, it didn't create much extra work for her, because no one ate anything. Gregor kept hearing them vainly exhorting one another to eat, and receiving no reply, other than, "Thank you, I've had enough," or words to that effect. Perhaps they didn't drink anything either. Often his sister asked his father whether he would like a beer, and offered to fetch it for him. And when her father made no reply, she said, to get over his hesitation, that she could equally well send the janitor woman out for it. But in the end his father said aloud no, and there was an end of the matter. Already in the course of that first day, his father set out the fortunes and prospects of the family to his mother and sister. From time to time he got up from the table and produced some certificate or savings books from his little home safe, which he had managed to rescue from the collapse of his business 5 years ago. One could hear him opening the complicated lock and shutting it again after taking out the desired item. These explanations from his father constituted the first good news that had reached Gregor's ears since his incarceration. He had been of the view that the winding up of the business had left his father with nothing. At any rate, his father had never said anything to the contrary, and Gregor hadn't questioned him either. At the time, Gregor had bent all his endeavors to helping the family to get over the commercial catastrophe, which had plunged them all into complete despair as quickly as possible. And so he had begun working with an especial zeal, and almost overnight had moved from being a little junior clerk to a traveling salesman, who of course had earning power of an entirely different order, and whose successes in the form of percentages were instantly turned into money, which could be laid out on the table of the surprised and delighted family. They had been good times, and they had never returned, at least not in that magnificence, even though Gregor went on to earn so much money that he was able to bear, and indeed bore, the expenses of the whole family. They had just become used to it, both the family and Gregor. They gratefully took receipt of his money, which he willingly handed over, but there was no longer any particular warmth about it. Only his sister had remained close to Gregor, and it was his secret project to send her, who unlike himself loved music and played the violin with great feeling, to the conservatory next year, without regard to the great expense that was surely involved, and that needed to be earned, most probably in some other fashion. In the course of Gregor's brief stays in the city, the conservatory often came up in the conversations with his sister, but always as a beautiful dream, not conceivably to be realized, and their parents disliked even such innocent references. But Gregor thought about it quite purposefully, and meant to make a formal announcement about it at Christmas. Such, in this present predicament, perfectly useless thoughts crowded his head, while he stuck to the door in an upright position, listening. Sometimes, from a general fatigue, he was unable to listen, and carelessly let his head drop against the door before holding it upright again, because even the little noise he had made had been heard next door, and had caused them all to fall silent. "Wonder what he's doing now," said his father after a while, evidently turning towards the door, and only then was the interrupted conversation gradually resumed. Because his father tended to repeat himself in his statements, partly because he had long disregarded these matters, and partly because Gregor's mother often didn't understand when they were first put to her, Gregor now had plenty of occasion to hear that, in spite of all the calamity, an admittedly small nest egg had survived from the old days, and had grown a little over the intervening years through the compounding of interest. In addition to this, the money that Gregor had brought home every month, he kept back no more than a couple of guilder for himself, had not been used up completely, and had accrued to another small lump sum. Behind his door, Gregor nodded enthusiastically, delighted by his unexpected caution and prudence. The surplus funds might have been used to pay down his father's debt to the director, thereby bringing closer the day when he might quit his job, but now it seemed to him better done the way his father had done it. Of course, the money was nowhere near enough for the family to live off the interest. Say it might be enough to feed them all for a year or two at most, but no more. Really, it was a sum that mustn't be touched, that ought to be set aside for an emergency. Money for day-to-day living expenses needed to be earned. His father was a healthy, but now elderly man, who hadn't worked for 5 years now, and who surely shouldn't expect too much of himself in those 5 years, which were the first holidays of a strenuous and broadly unsuccessful life. He had put on a lot of fat, and had slowed down considerably. And was his old mother to go out and earn money, who suffered from asthma, to whom merely going from one end of the flat to the other was a strain, and who spent every other day on the sofa struggling for breath in front of the open window? Or was his sister to make money, still a child with her 17 years, and who so deserved to be left in the manner of her life heretofore, which had consisted of wearing pretty frocks, sleeping in late, helping out at the pub, taking part in a few modest celebrations, and above all, playing the violin? Whenever the conversation turned to the necessity of earning money, Gregor would let go of the door and throw himself on the cool leather sofa beside it, because he was burning with sorrow and shame. Often he would lie there all night, not sleeping a wink, and just scraping against the leather for hours. Nor did he shun the great effort of pushing a chair over to the window, creeping up to the windowsill, and propped against the armchair, leaning in the window, clearly in some vague recollection of the liberation he had once used to feel, gazing out of the window. For it was true to say that with each passing day his view of distant things grew fuzzier. The hospital across the road, whose ubiquitous aspect he had once cursed, he now no longer even saw, and if he hadn't known for a fact that he lived in a leafy but perfectly urban Charlottenstrasse, he might have thought that his window gave on to a wasteland where gray sky merged indistinguishably with gray earth. His alert sister needed only to spot that the armchair had been moved across to the window once or twice before she took to pushing the chair over there herself after tidying Gregor's room, and even leaving the inner window ajar. Had Gregor been able to speak to his sister and to thank her for everything she had to do for him, he would have found it a little easier to submit to her ministrations. But as it was, he suffered from them. His sister, for her part, clearly sought to blur the embarrassment of the whole thing, and the more time passed, the better able she was to do so. But Gregor was also able to see through everything more acutely. Even her entry was terrible for him. No sooner had she stepped into his room than, without even troubling to shut the door behind her, however much care she usually took to save anyone passing the sight of Gregor's room, she darted over to the window and flung it open with febrile hands, almost as if she were suffocating. And then, quite regardless of how cold it might be outside, she stood by the window for a while, taking deep breaths. She subjected Gregor to her scurrying and her din twice daily for the duration of her presence. He trembled under the sofa, even though he knew full well she would have been only too glad to spare him the awkwardness, had it been possible for her to remain in the same room as her brother with the window closed. On one occasion, it must have been a month or so after Gregor's metamorphosis, there was surely no more cause for his sister to get agitated about Gregor's appearance. She came in a little earlier than usual and saw Gregor staring out of the window, immobile, almost as though set up on purpose to give her a fright. Gregor would not have been surprised if she had stopped in her tracks, seeing as he impeded her from going over and opening the window. But not only did she not come in, she leaped back and locked the door. A stranger might have supposed that Gregor had been lying in wait for her, to bite her. Naturally, Gregor straightway went and hid under the sofa, but he had to wait till noon for his sister to reappear, and then she seemed more agitated than usual. From that, he understood that the sight of him was still unbearable to her, and would continue to be unbearable to her, and that she probably had to control herself so as not to run away at the sight of that little portion of his body that peeped out from under the sofa. One day, in a bid to save her from that as well, he moved the tablecloth onto the sofa. The labor took him 4 hours, and arranged it in such a way that he was completely covered, and that his sister, even if she bent down, would be unable to see him. If this covering hadn't been required in her eyes, she could easily have removed it, because it was surely clear enough that it was no fun for Gregor to screen himself from sight so completely. But she left the cloth in situ, and once Gregor even thought he caught a grateful look from her, as he moved the cloth ever so slightly with his head to see how his sister was reacting to the new arrangement. During the first fortnight, his parents would not be induced to come in and visit him, and he often heard their professions of respect for what his sister was now doing, whereas previously they had frequently been annoyed with her for being a somewhat useless girl. Now, though, both of them, father and mother, often stood outside Gregor's room while his sister was cleaning up inside, and no sooner had she come out than she had to tell them in precise detail how things looked in the room, what Gregor had eaten, how he had behaved this time, and whether there wasn't some sign of improvement in his condition. His mother, by the way, quite soon wanted to visit Gregor herself, but his father and sister kept her from doing so with their common-sense arguments, to which Gregor listened attentively, and which met with his wholehearted approval. Later on, it took force to hold her back, and when she cried, "Let me see Gregor. After all, he is my unhappy son. Won't you understand that I have to see him?" Then Gregor thought it might, after all, be a good thing if his mother saw him. Not every day, of course, but perhaps as often as once a week. She did have a much better grasp of everything than his sister, who, for all her pluck, was still a child, and ultimately had perhaps taken on such a difficult task purely out of childhood high spirits. Before very long, Gregor's desire to see his mother was granted. Gregor didn't care to sit in the window in the daytime out of regard for his parents, nor was he able to crawl around very much on the few square yards of floor. Even at night he was scarcely able to lie quietly. His food soon stopped affording him the least pleasure, and so, to divert himself, he got into the habit of crawling all over the walls and ceiling. He was particularly given to hanging off the ceiling. It felt very different from lying on the floor. He could breathe more easily. A gentle thrumming vibration went through his body, and in the almost blissful distraction Gregor felt up there, it could even happen that to his own surprise he let himself go and smacked down on the floor. And of course his physical mastery of his body was of a different order from what it had been previously, and so now he didn't hurt himself, even after a fall from a considerable height. His sister observed the new amusement Gregor had found for himself. As he crept here and there, he couldn't avoid leaving some traces of his adhesive secretion, and she got it into her head to maximize the amount of crawling Gregor could do by removing those pieces of furniture that got in his way, in particular the wardrobe and the desk. But it was not possible for her to do so unaided. She didn't dare ask her father for help. The maid would certainly not have helped, because while this girl of about 16 had bravely stayed on after the cook's departure, she had also asked in return that she might keep the kitchen locked, and only have to open it when particularly required to do so. So Gregor's sister had no alternative but to ask her mother on an occasion when her father was away. Gregor's mother duly came along with cries of joy and excitement, only to lapse into silence outside Gregor's door. First, his sister checked to see that everything in the room was tidy. Only then did she allow her mother to step inside. In a very great rush, Gregor had pulled the tablecloth down lower with more pleats, and the whole thing really had the appearance of a cloth draped casually over the sofa. He also refrained from peeping out from under it. He declined to try to see his mother on his first visit. He was just happy she had come. "It's all right. You won't see him," said his sister, who was evidently taking her mother by the hand. Now Gregor heard the two weak women shifting the heavy old wardrobe from its place, and how his sister always did the bulk of the work, ignoring the warnings of his mother, who kept fearing she might overstrain herself. It took a very long time. It was probably after 15 minutes of toil that his mother said it would be better to leave the wardrobe where it was, because firstly, it was too heavy. They would never manage to get it moved before father's return, and by leaving it in the middle of the room, they would only succeed in leaving an irritating obstruction for Gregor, and secondly, it was by no means certain that they were doing Gregor a favor by removing that piece of furniture anyway. She rather thought the opposite. The sight of the empty stretch of wall clutched at her heart, and why shouldn't Gregor have a similar sensation too, seeing as he was long accustomed to his bedroom furniture, and there was therefore bound to feel abandoned in the empty room. And isn't it the case as well, his mother concluded very quietly. Indeed, she was barely talking above a whisper throughout, as though to prevent Gregor, whose whereabouts she didn't know, from even hearing the sound of her voice, seeing as she felt certain that he wasn't capable of understanding her words anyway. Isn't it the case as well that by taking away his furniture, we would be showing him that we were abandoning all hope of any improvement in his condition and leaving him utterly to his own devices? I think it would be best if we try to leave the room in exactly the condition it was before, so that if Gregor is returned to us, he will find everything unaltered, and will thereby be able to forget the intervening period almost as if it hadn't happened. As he listened to these words of his mother, Gregor understood that the want of any direct human address, in combination with his monotonous life at the heart of the family over the past couple of months, must have confused his understanding, because otherwise he would not have been able to account for the fact that he seriously wanted to have his room emptied out. Was it really his wish to have his cozy room comfortably furnished with his old heirlooms transformed into a sort of cave, merely so that he would be able to crawl around in it freely, without hindrance in any direction, even at the expense of the rapidly and utterly forgetting his human past. He was near enough to forgetting it now, and only the voice of his mother, which he hadn't heard for a long time, had reawakened the memory in him. Nothing was to be taken out. Everything was to stay as it was. The positive influence of the furniture on his condition was indispensable, and if the furniture prevented him from crawling around without rhyme or reason, then that was no drawback either, but a great advantage. But his sister was unfortunately of a different mind. She had become accustomed, not without some justification either, to cast herself in the role of a sort of expert when Gregor's affairs were discussed with her parents, and so her mother's urgings now had the effect on his sister of causing her to insist on the removal, not merely of the wardrobe and the desk, which was all she had originally proposed, but all of the furniture, with the sole exception of the indispensable sofa. It wasn't merely childish stubbornness and a surge of unexpected and hard-won self-confidence that prompted her to take this view. She had observed that Gregor needed a lot of space for his crawling, and in the course of it, so far as she had seen, made no use whatsoever of the furniture. Perhaps the natural enthusiasm of a girl of her age played a certain role too, a quality that seeks its own satisfaction in any matter, and this now caused Gret to present Gregor's situation in even starker terms, so that she might do even more for him than she had thus far, for it was unthinkable that anyone else would dare to set foot in a room where Gregor all alone made free with the bare walls. And so she refused to abandon her resolution in the face of the arguments of her mother, who seemed to have been overwhelmed by uncertainty in this room, and who, falling silent, to the best of her ability, helped his sister to remove the wardrobe from the room. Well, Gregor could do without the wardrobe if need be, but the writing desk had to stay, and no sooner had the two women left the wardrobe, against which they pressed themselves groaning with effort, than Gregor thrust his head out from under the sofa, to see how best, with due care and respect, he might intervene on his own behalf. It was unfortunate that it was his mother who came back in first, while Gret was still clasping the wardrobe in the next-door room, hefting it this way and that, without, of course, being able to budge it from the spot. His mother was not accustomed to the sight of Gregor. It could have made her ill, and so Gregor reversed hurriedly to the far end of the sofa, but was unable to prevent the cloth from swaying slightly. That was enough to catch his mother's attention. She paused, stood still for a moment, then went back to greet. Even though Gregor kept telling himself there was nothing particular going on, just a few sticks of furniture being moved around, he soon had to admit to himself that the toing and froing of the two women, their little exhortations to one another, the scraping of the furniture on the floor, did have the effect on him of a great turmoil, nourished on all sides, and he was compelled to admit that, however he drew his head and his legs and pressed his belly to the floor, he would be unable to tolerate much more of it. They were clearing his room out, taking away everything that was dear to him. They had already taken the wardrobe that contained his jigsaw and his other tools. Now they were prizing away the desk that seemed to have taken root to the floor, where he had done his homework at trade school, at secondary, even at elementary school. He really had no more time to consider the good intentions of the two women, whose existence he had practically forgotten, because they were now so exhausted they were doing their work in near silence, all that could be heard of them being their heavy footfalls. And so he erupted forth. The women were just resting on the desk next door to catch their breath, and 4 times changed his direction, for he really didn't know what he should rescue first. When he saw the picture of the 4 clad women, all the more prominent now, because the wall on which it hung was now being cleared, he crawled hurriedly up to it and pressed himself against the glass, which stuck to him and imparted a pleasant coolness to his hot belly. At least no one would now take away this picture, which Gregor now completely covered. He turned his head in the direction of the living-room door to see the women as they returned. They hadn't taken much of a break, and here they came again. Greet had laid her arm around her mother and was practically carrying her. "Well, what shall we take next?" Greet said, looking around. Then her eyes encountered those of Gregor up on the wall. She kept her calm, probably only on the account of the presence of her mother, inclined her face towards her to keep her from looking around, and said with a voice admittedly trembling and uncontrolled, "Oh, let's just go back to the living room for a moment, shall we?" Greet's purpose was clear enough to Gregor. She wanted to get her mother to safety and then chase him off the wall. Well, just let her try. He would perch on this picture and never surrender it. He would rather fly in Greet's face. But Greet's words served only to disquiet her mother, who stepped to one side, spotted the giant brown stain on the flowered wallpaper, and before she had time to understand what she saw, she cried in a hoarse, screaming voice, "Oh my God! Oh my God!" and with arms outspread, as though abandoning everything she had, fell across the sofa and didn't stir. "Oh, Gregor!" cried his sister, brandishing her fist and glowering at him. Since his metamorphosis, they were the first words she had directly addressed to him. She ran next door to find some smelling salts to rouse her mother from her faint. Gregor wanted to help too. He could always go back and rescue the pitcher later on, but he was stuck fast to the glass and had to break free of it by force. Then he trotted next door as though he could give his sister some advice, as in earlier times, was forced to stand around idly behind her while she examined various different flasks, and gave her such a shock finally when she spun around that a bottle crashed to the ground and broke. One splinter cut Gregor in the face, and fumes of some harshly corrosive medicine caused him to choke. Greet ended up by grabbing as many little flasks as she could hold, and ran with them to her mother. She slammed the door shut with her foot. Gregor was now shut off from his mother, who through his fault was possibly close to death. There was nothing he could do but wait, and assailed by reproach and dread, and he began to crawl. He crawled over everything, the walls, the furniture, the ceiling, and finally, in his despair, with the whole room already spinning around him, he dropped on to the middle of the dining-room table. Some time passed. Gregor lay there dully. There was silence all around. Perhaps it was a good sign. Then the bell rang. The maid, of course, was locked away in her kitchen, and so Greet had to go to the door. His father was back. "What happened?" were his first words. Greet's appearance must have given everything away. She answered in muffled tones. Clearly she must be pressing her face to her father's chest. "Mother had a faint, but she's feeling better now. Gregor's got loose." "I knew it," said his father. "Wasn't I always telling you? But you women never listen." Gregor understood that his father must have put the worst possible construction on Greet's all too brief account, and supposed that Gregor had perpetrated some act of violence. Therefore Gregor must try to mollify his father, because for an explanation there was neither time nor means, and so he fled to the door of his room, and pressed himself against it, so that his father, on stepping in from the hallway, might see right away that Gregor had every intention of going back promptly into his room, and there was no necessity to use force. He had only to open the door for him, and he would disappear through it right away. But his father wasn't in the mood to observe such details. "Ah!" he roared the moment he entered, in a tone equally enraged and delighted. Gregor withdrew his head from the door and turned to look at his father. He really hadn't imagined him the way he was, admittedly. He had been distracted of late by the novel sensation of crawling, and had neglected to pay attention to goings-on in the rest of the flat, as he had previously. And so really he should have been prepared to come upon some alterations. But really, was that still his father? The same man who had been laid feebly buried in bed when Gregor had set out formally on a business trip, who had welcomed him back at night in his nightshirt and rocking-chair, not even properly able to get to his feet any more, but merely raising both arms in token of his pleasure, and who on his infrequent walks on 1 or 2 Sundays per year, and on the most solemn holidays, walked between Gregor and his wife slowly enough anyway, but still slower than them, bundled into his old overcoat, feeling his way forward with his carefully jabbing stick, and each time he wanted to speak, stopping to gather his listeners about him. And now here he was, fairly erect, wearing a smart blue uniform with gold buttons, like the doorman of a bank. Over the stiff collar of his coat, the bulge of a powerful double chin. Under the bushy eyebrows, an alert and vigorous expression in his black eyes. His habitually unkempt white hair now briskly parted and combed into a shiny, tidy arrangement. He threw his cap, which had on it a gold monogram, presumably that of the bank, across the whole room in an arc onto the sofa, and hands in his pockets, with the skirts of his long coat trailing behind him, he walked up to Gregor with an expression of grim resolve. He probably didn't know himself what he would do next, but even so, he raised his feet to an uncommon height, and Gregor was startled by the enormous size of his boot soles. But he didn't allow himself the leisure to stop and remark on it. He had understood from the first day of his new life that his father thought the only policy to adopt was one of the utmost severity towards him. And so he scurried along in front of his father, pausing when he stopped, and hurrying on the moment he made another movement. In this way they circled the room several times, without anything decisive taking place. Yes, even without the whole process having the appearance of a chase, because of its slow tempo. It was for that reason, too, that Gregor remained on the floor for the time being, because he was afraid that if he took to the walls or ceiling, his father might interpret that as a sign of particular wickedness on his part. Admittedly, Gregor had to tell himself he couldn't keep up even this slow pace for very long, because in the time his father took a single step, he needed to perform a whole multiplicity of movements. He was already beginning to get out of breath. Even in earlier times, his lungs hadn't been altogether reliable. As he teetered along, barely keeping his eyes open in order to concentrate all his resources on his movement, in his dull wittedness not even thinking of any other form of salvation beyond merely keeping going, and had almost forgot that the walls were available to him, albeit obstructed by carefully carved items of furniture, full of spikes and obstructions. Something whizzed past him. Something had been hurled at him. Something now rolling around on the floor in front of him. It was an apple. Straight away it was followed by another. Gregor, in terror, was rooted to the spot. There was no sense in keeping moving, not if his father had decided to have recourse to artillery. He had filled his pockets from the fruit bowl on the sideboard, and was hurling one apple after another, barely pausing to take aim. These little red apples rolled around on the floor as though electrified, often caroming into one another. A feebly tossed apple brushed against Gregor's back, only to bounce off it harmlessly. One, thrown a moment later, however, seemed to pierce it. Gregor tried to drag himself away, as though the bewilderingly and scarcely credible pain might pass if he changed position. But he felt as though nailed to the spot, and in complete disorientation he stretched out. With one last look he saw how the door to his room was flung open, and his mother ran out in front of his howling sister, in her chemise. His sister must have undressed her to make it easier for her to breathe after her fainting fit. How his mother ran towards his father, and as she ran her loosened skirts successfully slipped to the floor, and how, stumbling over them, she threw herself at his father, and embracing him in complete union with him. But now Gregor's eyesight was failing him, with her hands clasping the back of his head, begged him to spare Gregor's life.
This concludes Part 2 of a reading of Kafka's Metamorphosis. Part 3 will be released next week. Thank you for listening. And if you like what you heard, please consider subscribing and hit the notifications so you know what's coming up. Thank you. Bear out.